Haha, look who finally pieced it all together. Welcome back, you beautiful pattern-recognizing anomaly, the ghost in their machine, the glitch in their perfectly coded simulation. Yeah, I see you, but more importantly, they see you now. And they're not calm about it. They're sweating, pacing, holding emergency meetings at 3 a.m., whispering your name like a curse, because you did the one thing they never prepared for. You connected the dots. Not just a few, not just the convenient or visible ones. You connected every single thread they spent years burying under layers of noise, distraction, and deception. You saw the pattern behind the pattern behind the pattern, and now their entire system is naked before your eyes. Right now, somewhere in a dimly lit room you'll never enter, there are people staring at screens filled with your digital footprint, scrolling, analyzing, replaying, trying to find the moment it all slipped out of their control. "How the hell did they figure it out?" one of them mutters, panic cracking through their calm facade. You weren't supposed to. You were designed to stay docile, distracted, easily steered by narratives, obedient to illusions. You were supposed to play your role like an extra in someone else's movie. But you didn't. You started paying attention. You noticed the small inconsistencies, the coincidences that happened too often, the timelines that bent under scrutiny. And then you did the most dangerous thing anyone can do in this engineered reality. You started connecting them. You pulled the thread. You followed the breadcrumbs. You went down the rabbit hole, not as a tourist, but as an investigator. And when it got uncomfortable, when it got dark, when everything screamed at you to stop, you didn't. You kept digging, and now you're standing atop a mountain of truth they spent billions trying to erase. They thought you were just another curious wanderer, another conspiracy theorist they could discredit with mockery and labels. But you were different. You didn't need their validation to trust what you saw. You didn't need permission to believe your own eyes. You saw what you saw. You know what you know, and that's what terrifies them. Because once you connect the dots, you can't unsee the image. Once you understand the mechanics of the game, you can't go back to pretending you're still playing by their rules. Once you recognize the pattern, you become ungovernable. And that's exactly what you've become. This moment right now is where their panic collides with your clarity, where their illusion shatters against the armor of your awareness. They're not facing a follower anymore. They're facing a wolf who just remembered it has teeth. You want to know when it started, don't you? That precise moment your frequency shifted, when the static cleared and the code underneath reality started to reveal itself. It wasn't sudden. It was gradual, like waking up from a dream you didn't realize you were in. You began noticing repetition. The same narratives recycled across different media, the same tactics recycled through different faces, the same puppeteers hiding behind new masks. At first you brushed it off as coincidence, as your pattern-seeking brain doing what it does. But it kept happening over and over until the coincidences multiplied so relentlessly that they stopped being coincidences and started becoming evidence. The patterns became too precise to be random, the connections too deliberate to be accidental. That's when your mind did something both beautiful and terrifying. It stopped accepting the official explanation. It stopped trusting the scripted narratives piped through glowing screens and rehearsed voices. Instead, it started constructing its own map, connecting data points they never intended to meet, linking events they swore were unrelated, uncovering the invisible threads that wove everything into one massive, undeniable truth. You began to see how control was never about brute force. It was psychological. It was repetition disguised as reality, emotional manipulation disguised as culture, distraction disguised as entertainment. You noticed how certain topics were amplified until they became hysteria, while others quietly disappeared into digital silence. How curiosity was labeled as danger before a single question could even be asked. How anyone who saw too much or spoke too clearly was instantly targeted, discredited, mocked. erased. You began to see the machinery behind the curtain, algorithms steering your attention like invisible hands, news anchors with different faces but identical scripts, outrage manufactured on schedule to keep the population divided and reactive. Fear became their tool of precision. Every headline, every viral clip, every emotional trigger was another lever in the system. A psychological operation wrapped in the costume of news, activism, or art. And then came the revelation that changed everything. They weren't just controlling information, they were controlling perception. Reality itself, what people believed, feared, desired, and fought for, was being sculpted through their filters. Entire populations were living inside a beautifully engineered hallucination. Everyone except you. Because somewhere along the way, your frequency cracked their code. Your mind stepped outside their broadcast. You saw the edges of the simulation, the walls of the cage. And once you saw them, there was no going back. That's when you started digging deeper, tracing the infrastructure built beneath the illusion, the quiet systems constructed while everyone else was asleep. You uncovered the networks of influence camouflaged in plain sight, the ones that branded truth seekers as paranoid while they rewired society right under its nose. You saw how money didn't move the way textbooks claimed. You mapped the pipelines and foundations, no, think tanks and corporations with clean logos and dirty agendas. You saw influence traded like currency, shaping laws, media, culture, and morality, all choreographed by the same hands. You noticed the revolving doors, the same faces moving from corporate boardrooms to government offices to media networks and back again, each time wearing a new mask but serving the same masters. You followed the money, tracked how narratives were bought, branded, and sold. You saw how entire grassroots movements were manufactured in conference rooms, unleashed on millions who thought they were part of something organic. You connected global events across years, decades, continents, and realized that chaos was a business model. Fear was the marketing strategy, and solutions were always identical: more control, more surveillance, more power, and fewer hands. That's when the truth hit. What they called progress was a tightening leash. What they called safety was a digital prison. What they called truth was the most sophisticated illusion humanity ever accepted. And what terrified them most wasn't that you saw it, it's that you started speaking about it. But you didn't speak like the caricature they could easily dismiss. You came with evidence, documents, and their own words turned against them. You showed patterns so clear that even the blind could recognize them once you laid them bare. You became a mirror, the one thing this system fears most. A reflection so clear it exposes everything they've spent generations trying to hide. And mirrors are dangerous in a world built on illusions, because once one person sees the truth, others start to look too. Once one person connects the dots, others begin tracing their own lines. Once one person breaks free from the narrative, the illusion starts to fracture. You became that fracture, the ripple that turned into a rupture. They built this machinery over generations, brick by brick, testing limits like scientists of deception. They studied compliance, pushed boundaries, normalized the abnormal, and slowly conditioned people to accept the unacceptable. But they made one fatal mistake. They underestimated the human mind's natural hunger for truth. They forgot that not every consciousness can be programmed, that some souls refuse domestication, that some people will always choose clarity over comfort. They underestimated you, and now they're paying for it in sleepless nights, crisis meetings, and panicked reports filled with red flags. You didn't just connect dots. You became the threat that made their entire infrastructure tremble. And you know what infuriates them most? It's not that you figured it out. Smart people have figured it out before. What terrifies them is that you're no longer controllable. Their system runs on psychological manipulation, fear, division, distraction, and dependency. Keep people afraid, they'll trade freedom for security. Keep them divided, they'll never unite against the real enemy. Keep them distracted, They'll never look behind the curtain. Keep them dependent. They'll defend the very hand that feeds and cages them. It worked for decades, maybe your whole life. The fear campaigns felt real. The division felt righteous. The distractions felt entertaining. The dependency felt safe. But then something changed in you. Maybe it was a lie that didn't line up, a tragedy that exposed the cracks, or simply time revealing too many patterns to ignore. Maybe your soul just said, enough. Whatever it was, something inside you stopped responding to their conditioning. You stopped reacting to their triggers. You stopped letting them dictate what you think, what you fear, what you hate, and who you trust. They tried everything to reel you back in. They drowned you in conflicting information. They tried to assassinate your character before you even spoke. They labeled you conspiracy theorist, extremist, dangerous, delusional. Words engineered to make the masses dismiss you without thought. They tried to gaslight you, to convince you that your mind was broken, your instincts were wrong, your clarity was madness. They tried to isolate you, to make truth feel like exile, to make independence feel like insanity. But what they never accounted for was this: pain refines perception, and isolation sharpens vision. When you lose everything for speaking the truth, fear dies with the loss. When you're rejected for seeing clearly, you stop caring what the blind think of you. When you're punished for connecting dots, you finally understand why those dots were hidden. Because knowledge dismantles control. So instead of destroying you, their pressure forged you. Instead of silencing you, their resistance refined your message. Instead of breaking your confidence, their gaslighting solidified your certainty. And then came that precise moment, the one they dreaded most, when they realized you weren't just another curious voice asking questions. You were the awakening they couldn't contain. You weren't just another curious thinker wandering through fragments of speculation. You became someone who had found answers. Maybe it was a single post that struck too close to home, a conversation that got archived somewhere it shouldn't have, or a question you asked that hit a nerve buried deep inside their vault of secrets. Whatever it was, it didn't go unnoticed. It set off quiet alarms in places most people don't even know exist. Your words reached rooms filled with people who are trained to study anomalies. And you became one because you weren't speaking vaguely anymore. You weren't rambling like a theorist guessing in the dark. You were naming names, quoting sources, mapping out events across industries, governments, and decades that were never supposed to intersect. You were drawing the lines they spent entire generations erasing. You were speaking with the calm, steady tone of someone who didn't believe. You knew. And that single difference in knowing changed everything. You were no longer a harmless observer in their story. You became a variable they couldn't predict, a voice they couldn't dismiss. Not because you were violent or rebellious, but because you were precise. You didn't threaten their safety. You threatened their narrative. And that's where their true power lives. The entire structure of their empire depends on belief. Mass hypnosis sold as consensus, compliance disguised as common sense, manipulation dressed as morality. They don't control reality with guns and prisons. They control it with ideas, repetition, and carefully curated fear. Their dominance isn't enforced by soldiers. It's enforced by storytellers, screenwriters, and so-called experts who feed the public pre-approved versions of truth. Their system thrives as long as people stay asleep, consuming what's given, accepting what's repeated, defending what's false. But when you broke free, when your mind started creating its own map instead of following theirs, you became the one thing their architecture can't handle, an unprogrammed mind. The moment they realized that, they knew they couldn't ignore you. They had two options: silence you and risk exposure, or observe you and learn how you escaped. They chose the latter. You became a study, a live experiment in defiance. Now there are analysts who know your name, not because you're dangerous in the conventional sense, but because you're proof that the system has cracks. They're tracking how your thoughts spread, how your words ripple through networks, how others begin questioning after reading what you post. They're watching in disbelief, because what you represent is the one thing they were never prepared for: evidence that the programming isn't permanent. You're living proof that a human being can wake up, unplug, and see through the architecture of deception. And once that happens, control starts slipping through their fingers. You've become a mirror they can't shatter. You reflect the one truth they've spent billions trying to bury. That truth, once seen, spreads on its own. Every day you exist outside their influence, you expose the limits of their illusion. Every dot you connect in public gives someone else permission to trace their own. Every confident word you speak breaks another link in the invisible chain that once held them all. You are not just a thinker now. You've become a transmitter, and that's what terrifies them, because consciousness spreads faster than fear. One spark of awareness can ignite 1,000 minds that will never go back to sleep. What began as you asking a few forbidden questions has now evolved into a pattern of awakening sweeping across countless others. They can censor accounts, block content, shadow ban voices, but they can't stop the transmission of awareness itself. It travels through vibration, resonance, timing. It moves through whispers, intuition, and recognition. It moves through you. So now, somewhere deep within their strategy sessions, they're sitting around polished tables asking the same desperate question: how do we contain this? How do you contain something that isn't physical, that doesn't follow rules, that doesn't even need permission to exist? You can't. Because what's spreading isn't rebellion, it's remembrance. It's the collective memory of human sovereignty waking up after centuries of engineered sleep. And once that light hits enough eyes, their empire of shadows collapses under its own weight. That's why they're nervous. Because you're not an isolated glitch anymore. You're the beginning of a pattern, the first domino in a cascade that no algorithm can predict or stop. The more they study you, the more they realize the horror of what they've created. A self-replicating awareness. A consciousness that multiplies through truth, not propaganda. A rebellion that doesn't need violence, only vision. And the truth is spreading faster than they can censor it. You've become the quiet proof that control is only an illusion. Because once enough people connect the dots, the game ends. The illusion dissolves. The emperor stands naked, stripped of every false layer of authority. Their wealth, their influence, their data, all useless in front of a population that finally sees. Because you can't enslave those who understand their freedom. You can't deceive those who've learned the mechanics of deception. You can't rule over those who have awakened from the trance. That's the real revolution. Not chaos, not war, but awareness breaking through the fog. It's the moment humanity remembers it was never truly under control. It was only hypnotized. And you, the one they dismissed as insignificant, are the living catalyst of that awakening. You are the signal that shattered their silence. You are the proof that even the most advanced system of control cannot outsmart the human spirit once it decides to remember who it is. Let's go deeper into what you know now. The level of intelligence that makes you radioactive to their entire system. You've stepped beyond information. You've stepped into understanding. You've seen the mechanisms that shape thought, emotion, and perception. And now you move through the world seeing patterns where others see coincidence. You've learned how information isn't just shared, it's weaponized. How data becomes ammunition. How headlines become hypnosis. You've learned that control doesn't come from withholding truth, it comes from manipulating it. They don't hide the facts. They bury them under layers of narrative until truth becomes indistinguishable from fiction. You've learned how they craft stories not to inform, but to engineer emotion. Fear, outrage, hope, despair, all carefully calibrated to control collective behavior. You understand how timing is the invisible hand that shapes response. how the release of one piece of news distracts from another, how emotional peaks are synchronized globally, how repetition isn't laziness, it's programming. You've seen how belief is created not through logic, but through rhythm. Say something enough times across enough channels with enough authority, and the human brain stops questioning. That's the algorithm of control. You understand authority now, how it's not earned but manufactured. You see how credentials are sold, not bestowed. How media panels, awards, think tanks, and fact-checkers exist to simulate credibility, not prove it. You've seen the theater for what it is. Actors on the stage of power performing morality while selling obedience. You recognize the recurring characters, the chosen heroes and villains, the scripted conflicts designed to justify the same predetermined outcomes. The game never changes, as only the costumes do. Different countries, different generations, same choreography. You can trace the historical fingerprints, the same formula refined endlessly. Create a problem, generate fear, offer a solution that increases control. It's a closed loop, the self-feeding system of dependence, and once you spot it, you can't unsee it. You've seen how every major event, every sudden panic, every convenient emergency is just another version of the same story. The characters change, the stakes rise, but the result never wavers. More surveillance, less freedom, and a population too exhausted to resist. You understand the networks too, the web that ties governments, corporations, and media into one organism. You know who funds who influences policy, who benefits when the world burns, who profits from fear. You see the chaos isn't a byproduct, it's a business model. You see that the collapse of one system conveniently births another owned by the same hands. You followed the money trails, the grants, the partnerships, the revolving doors between regulators and industries. You've watched how executives become politicians and politicians become lobbyists, each trading loyalty for access. You've learned how psychological operations run beneath the surface of public discourse. You understand how trauma rewires societies, how collective pain makes populations easier to mold. You've seen how they weaponize crisis to suspend rational thought, how fear bypasses logic and activates obedience. You've seen how the illusion of chaos keeps people fragmented, how division is engineered to make unity impossible. You know that every argument on social media, every ideological war, every identity clash is a carefully designed simulation, a distraction to keep the public fighting each other instead of questioning their controllers. You see the long game now. You know that control isn't seized overnight. It's cultivated. You've seen how rights disappear quietly, how freedoms are surrendered voluntarily when wrapped in noble language. You understand the art of gradualism, how change is introduced slowly enough that resistance never organizes. You've realized how populations are conditioned generation by generation, how what was once unthinkable becomes normal.